The sky was a muted gray, heavy with unspoken sorrow, as mourners gathered at the small cemetery. A light breeze stirred the leaves of the towering oak trees, adding a faint rustling to the somber silence. The community had come together to say goodbye to a man they all knew. A man who had lived a life of quiet dignity, respected by those around him. David stood near the front, gripping the edges of his jacket to shield himself from the cold. His eyes remained fixed on the dark, polished coffin in front of him, trying to come to terms with the fact that his father was gone. Beside him, Max, his father's loyal German shepherd, sat quietly, his head bowed as though he too was mourning. Max had been his father's constant companion for years, and seeing the dog's forlorn posture made the loss even more tangible. As the priest began his eulogy, a soft murmur of respect and sadness swept through the crowd. People nodded solemnly at the priest's words, remembering the man they had come to honor. But for David, the words felt distant, almost hollow. He wasn't sure if it was the cold wind or the weight of grief, but something didn't feel right. Suddenly, Max stood up. David glanced down at the dog, surprised by the sudden movement. Max was normally well-behaved, but now his ears were perked, and his posture was tense. Before David could react, Max threw his head back and let out a long, mournful howl that echoed through the cemetery. The sound was raw, full of anguish, and it cut through the air like a blade, startling everyone present. The priest paused mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he stared at the dog. The mourners turned, murmuring to each other in confusion. David bent down to grab Max's collar, trying to calm him, but the dog wouldn't stop. Max howled again, louder this time, his body trembling as though he was trying to communicate something beyond words. "Max, stop!" David whispered urgently, pulling at the dog's collar. But Max wouldn't be silenced. His eyes were fixed on the coffin as if it were the only thing that mattered in the world. The tension in the air grew thick. Some of the mourners exchanged nervous glances, while others tried to comfort David, assuming that Max's behavior was simply a reflection of the dog's grief. But David knew Max well, and this was something different. This wasn't just sorrow, it was desperation. The priest cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the service. "Let us remember the good this man has done," he began again, his voice shaky. But Max howled once more, this time with such intensity that even the priest faltered. His gaze shifted from the crowd to the dog, an unreadable expression crossing his face. David's heart raced. There was something wrong. He could feel it in the way Max refused to back down. The way the dog's howls seemed to carry a message that no one could understand. One of the older mourners, a family friend named Mrs. Hargrove, stepped closer to David, her voice a whisper. "He's trying to tell us something, David. Dogs, they sense things we can't." David glanced at her, unsure of what to say. Was she right? Was Max sensing something beyond grief? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He looked back at the coffin, his mind swirling with questions he couldn't answer. The priest finally stopped, unable to continue the service. The atmosphere had shifted from solemn respect to uneasy confusion. Max's howls had unnerved everyone, and the ceremony felt incomplete, as though something was left unsaid. "Perhaps we should take a moment," the priest suggested, his voice quiet, almost as if he were afraid to continue. "Let us gather our thoughts." David seized the opportunity to pull Max away, guiding the dog to a small clearing at the edge of the cemetery. Max's howls quieted, but his body remained tense, his eyes never leaving the coffin. The dog stood at attention like a soldier guarding a secret. David knelt beside him, stroking his fur in an attempt to calm him down. "What's going on, boy?" he whispered. "What are you trying to tell me?" Max didn't respond, of course, but the intensity in his eyes sent a chill through David. It was as if the dog knew something that David didn't. Something important. For the first time since the funeral had begun, David felt a deep sense of unease, as though the ground beneath him was shifting. In the distance, the mourners were beginning to murmur again, uncertain of how to proceed. The priest, standing by the coffin, looked as though he wanted to continue, but he kept glancing toward David and Max, his face pale and troubled. Something was wrong. David didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in his bones. Max's howls had disrupted more than just a funeral. They had disturbed something deeper, something unspoken. And as David stood there watching the scene unfold, He couldn't shake the feeling that his father had left behind more than just memories. He had left behind a secret, one that Max was trying to reveal. But what was it? David tightened his grip on Max's collar, his mind racing. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for sure: the funeral was far from over. The air was thick with tension as David returned to the funeral, Max still by his side, though quieter now. The dog's restless energy seemed to linger, like an unspoken warning that clung to the atmosphere. The murmurs from the mourners had grown louder, confusion and unease spreading among them as they struggled to understand Max's strange behavior. David couldn't stop thinking about what Mrs. Hargrove had said. "He's trying to tell us something." The thought gnawed at him. But before he could dwell on it, the priest cleared his throat and called for everyone's attention. His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by a visible unease. The crowd gradually quieted, their eyes fixed on the priest. He stood at the head of the coffin, his hands trembling slightly as he held on to the edges of his Bible. His eyes flicked toward David and Max before settling on the mourners, his expression troubled. The priest paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "I need to say something." David felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure why, but the priest's hesitation filled him with dread. The man was usually calm, methodical in his words, yet now there was a tremor in his voice, something David had never heard before. The priest took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if gathering his courage. "I have carried this burden for years," he began, his voice low but clear. "And I fear it is time for me to speak, though it was never my intention to do so today." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. David's pulse quickened. He glanced at Max, whose ears were perked again, alert. The dog's earlier howls seemed to hang over them like a shadow, a prelude to something bigger. "What is he talking about?" someone murmured. The priest opened his eyes and looked directly at David. "Your father came to me years ago. He confided in me about something I have kept secret out of respect for him. But now, with him gone, and after what just happened with Max, I can no longer remain silent." David's heart pounded. What could his father have confessed? "Your father was a good man," the priest continued, his voice wavering slightly. "But he was not without his burdens. He carried guilt, a heavy guilt that weighed on him for years. It was something he wanted to make amends for, but never found the strength to do." The whispers grew louder. David felt the ground shift beneath him, as though everything he thought he knew about his father was being called into question. Guilt? His father had never shown signs of regret or shame, at least not to him. Max shifted restlessly at David's side, his eyes once again fixed on the coffin. The tension between them all was palpable now, thick enough to cut through. The priest stepped closer to the coffin, his gaze still on David. "He made me swear never to reveal this, but I can't ignore what's happening. Max, he knows something. Dogs have an intuition about these things." David clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check. His father had been a pillar of strength, someone who had always guided him with wisdom and care. What could he have done that required such secrecy? And why now, after all these years, was the priest revealing it? "What guilt are you talking about?" David's voice came out stronger than he expected, the question heavy with urgency. "What did my father tell you?" The priest hesitated, glancing down at the coffin, as though debating whether to continue. Then, with a heavy sigh, he spoke. "Your father, he was involved in something when you were younger. Something that haunted him. He asked for my forgiveness, but he couldn't forgive himself." David's throat tightened. "What was it?" The priest's eyes met his, full of regret. "There was an accident, a tragic accident that your father never spoke of. It involved someone from this town, and he always believed it was his fault. He was never able to make peace with it." An accident. David's mind raced, trying to recall anything from his childhood that might match the priest's words, but nothing came to mind. His father had always been careful, thoughtful. It didn't make sense. Max let out a low whine, nudging David's leg as if urging him to act. David stepped forward, his voice rising with frustration. "Why didn't he ever tell me? Why would he keep this from me?" The priest shook his head sadly. "He thought he was protecting you, David. He believed that by keeping it buried, you could live your life free from the weight of his mistakes." The words hit David like a punch to the gut. His father, the man he had always admired, had been hiding something so significant, something that had clearly tormented him. And now, standing at his grave, David felt the full impact of that hidden truth. The crowd was eerily silent, watching the exchange unfold with bated breath. No one moved, no one spoke. "What kind of accident?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. The priest hesitated, his gaze shifting to the coffin once more. "I don't know all the details, but it involved someone close to him, someone who didn't survive." David's knees weakened, and he had to steady himself against Max, who pressed closer to him, offering silent support. The idea of his father carrying such a secret, such a heavy guilt, made his stomach churn. All these years, his father had been haunted by something he never spoke of, and now that secret had surfaced, tearing through the image David had of him. Max let out another soft whine, and David knelt down beside the dog, feeling an overwhelming rush of emotion. He buried his face in Max's fur for a moment, trying to make sense of the revelations. The priest spoke again, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, David. I kept this secret for him, but perhaps it was wrong to do so. Max, I believe he knows. Dogs always know." David's mind spun with questions, but for now, all he could feel was the weight of loss. Loss not only of his father, but of the truth he had never been given. And as he stood there, next to Max in the coffin, he realized that this funeral had become far more than just a farewell. It was the beginning of an unraveling. David couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play. The revelation from the priest had left him reeling, but it was the way Max had reacted. The dog's refusal to leave the coffin, his howls of desperation, that convinced David there was more to the story than anyone was willing to say. As the crowd began to disperse, leaving the cemetery in a heavy silence, David remained standing near the grave, lost in thought. His father had carried this secret for years, and yet David had never seen a hint of it. The man who had raised him had always seemed steady, unshaken. But now the cracks were showing, and David was left wondering just how deep they went. Max paced restlessly beside him, his body still tense as he sniffed the air around the grave. David crouched down, running his hand along the dog's back, trying to comfort both Max and himself. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" David whispered, glancing toward the coffin. The dog had always been sensitive, more so than any other animal David had known. If there was something more to his father's past, David had no doubt that Max could sense it. As the last of the mourners disappeared behind the cemetery gates, David felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Mrs. Hargrove, her weathered face filled with concern. "David, dear," she said softly, "I couldn't help but notice how troubled you seem." David stood up, offering her a weak smile. "It's a lot to take in," he admitted, glancing back at the coffin. "I didn't know my father had so many unresolved issues." Mrs. Hargrove nodded, her gray eyes flickering with something David couldn't quite place. Sympathy, perhaps, or maybe knowledge. "Your father was a good man, David," she said quietly. "Good men sometimes make mistakes. He carried the burden of that mistake for a long time." David frowned, his curiosity piqued. "Do you know what happened?" "The priest mentioned an accident, but he didn't give me much to go on." For a moment, Mrs. Hargrove looked as though she might say more, but then she hesitated, her gaze drifting to the ground. "It's not my place to say," she murmured, her voice barely audible. David's frustration grew. It seemed like everyone knew something except him. And the more he tried to piece together his father's past, the more elusive the truth became. "Please," David said, stepping closer to her. "If you know anything, anything at all, I need to hear it." Mrs. Hargrove sighed, her expression softening. "It was a long time ago," she began, her voice low. "You were just a boy. There was an accident. Someone died. Your father, he never forgave himself for it." David's heart skipped a beat. The words echoed in his mind. Someone died. But who? And how was his father involved? "Who was it?" David asked, his voice hoarse. Mrs. Hargrove glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. Then she leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a young woman, someone from the town. She and your father were close once, but things went wrong. No one knew the full details. It was all very quiet, swept under the rug." David's mind raced, trying to process this new information. A young woman? His father had never mentioned any relationships outside of his mother, and David had no memory of anyone who fit that description. "What was her name?" he asked, desperate for answers. Mrs. Hargrove shook her head sadly. "I don't remember. It was so long ago, and people stopped talking about it after a while. But your father, he never moved past it. That's why he asked the priest to keep his confession secret. He didn't want to tarnish his memory." David felt a chill run down his spine. His father, the man who had always seemed so strong, had been haunted by a mistake that had cost someone their life. And now, David was left to unravel the truth. Max let out a low growl, pulling David's attention back to the present. The dog was circling the coffin again, his nose to the ground, as if he were searching for something. David watched him, a sense of unease growing in his chest. "What is it, Max?" David asked, kneeling beside the dog. But Max didn't respond. He simply continued to sniff, his body tense, his focus unbroken. Mrs. Hargrove stepped back, giving David space. "He senses something, doesn't he?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. David nodded, watching Max closely. The dog had always been intuitive, but this was different. It was as if Max was leading him somewhere, trying to show him something hidden beneath the surface. Without warning, Max barked, a sharp, urgent sound that echoed through the cemetery. He darted toward a patch of earth just beside the grave, digging furiously with his paws. "Max!" David called, rushing over to stop him, but the dog wouldn't be deterred. He continued to dig, his movements frantic, his tail stiff with tension. David hesitated for a moment, then crouched beside the dog, helping to clear the dirt. His hands moved instinctively, though he wasn't sure what he was looking for. All he knew was that Max seemed determined to uncover something. After a few minutes, David's fingers brushed against something hard, something buried just beneath the surface. He paused, his heart racing. Slowly, he cleared away the remaining dirt, revealing a small metal box, weathered and old. Mrs. Hargrove gasped softly. "What is that?" David didn't answer. His hands trembled as he lifted the box from the ground, wiping away the dirt that clung to its surface. It was locked, but the lock looked weak, as though it had rusted with time. Max sat beside him, watching intently, his eyes never leaving the box. David's pulse quickened. Whatever this box contained, it had been buried here for a reason, and as he held it in his hands, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning of the secrets his father had left behind. David stared at the small metal box in his hands, his mind racing. It felt cold and heavy, both literally and figuratively. What could it contain? And why had it been buried near his father's grave? The weight of the secrets his father had taken to the grave was starting to feel unbearable. David wasn't sure if he was ready to confront whatever was inside, but a part of him knew that he couldn't walk away now. Not after everything Max had shown him. Max, now calmer but still watchful, sat beside David, his gaze fixed on the box as though he understood the significance of the moment. His presence gave David a sense of stability amidst the emotional storm swirling inside him. He took a deep breath and looked at Mrs. Hargrove, who stood nearby, her eyes wide with anticipation and concern. "I don't know if I should open it," David said quietly, more to himself than to her. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his fingers over the rusted lock. Mrs. Hargrove nodded solemnly. "Sometimes the truth isn't easy to face, David, but maybe it's what your father would have wanted. Maybe that's why Max led you here." David's throat tightened. He hadn't considered that. His father had always been a man of few words, but maybe this, whatever was inside the box, was his final message, something he had left behind for David to find when the time was right. With a shaky breath, David made up his mind. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Whatever his father's secret was, it had haunted him long enough, and David couldn't let it continue to cast a shadow over his life. He needed to know. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees, and nodded toward Mrs. Hargrove. "I'll take this home. I'll open it when I'm ready." Mrs. Hargrove placed a hand on his arm, offering a gentle squeeze. "Take your time, dear, but remember, whatever's inside, it doesn't change the man your father was. We're all flawed in one way or another." David gave her a weak smile, appreciating the sentiment, though he wasn't sure if it would be enough to soften whatever blow might come next. As they walked back toward the cemetery gate, Max stayed close to David's side, his steps steady and sure. The dog had led him to this moment, and David knew he wouldn't have the strength to face it without Max's unwavering loyalty. Later that evening, David sat at the kitchen table, the box in front of him, its presence weighing heavily on the room. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence only broken by the occasional creak of the floorboards and Max's soft breathing as he lay at David's feet. The box stared back at him, an unspoken challenge. The rusted lock looked fragile, as though it would break easily with just a little force. David had considered finding a tool to pry it open, but something inside him wanted to take this moment slowly, to let it unfold naturally. Max, sensing the tension, sat up and watched David closely. David unfolded the top sheet of paper and his eyes scanned the faded handwriting. The letter was addressed to him in his father's unmistakable script. He felt his chest tighten as he read the first line. "My dearest David, if you are reading this, then I am no longer with you, and I fear that I have left too many things unsaid." David's eyes blurred with tears. His father had written him a letter, one that he had never intended to give while he was alive. It was a final confession, perhaps, a final attempt to explain the things he had kept hidden. He continued reading, his heart heavy with each word. "There are parts of my life that I never shared with you, not because I didn't trust you, but because I was ashamed of the mistakes I made. There was an accident, David, one that I have carried with me every day. A young woman died, and though it was an accident, I could never forgive myself for what happened." David's breath hitched. His mind flashed back to what Mrs. Hargrove had said, the vague reference to a young woman. This was the confirmation he had dreaded, the moment when his father's carefully constructed image began to crumble. Her name was Margaret, and she and I were close once, too close. The night she died, it was my fault. We were driving, and I lost control of the car. I survived, but she didn't. David's hands trembled as he set the letter down, unable to read any further. His father had been responsible for a death, an accident that had taken someone's life and haunted him for years. It was a burden that he had carried alone, never sharing it with anyone, not even his own son. Max nudged David's leg, pulling him back to the present. The dog's eyes were filled with quiet understanding, as if he too felt the weight of the secret now revealed. David wiped at his eyes, his mind racing with questions. Who was Margaret? Why had his father never told him? Had anyone else known about the accident? He picked up the letter again, desperate for more answers. "I wanted to tell you, David, but I couldn't bear the thought of you looking at me differently. I know now that keeping this from you was a mistake, but I thought I was protecting you. I thought that if you didn't know, you could remember me as the father you always believed in." David's tears flowed freely now. His father had been a flawed man, just like Mrs. Hargrove had said. He had made a terrible mistake, one that had cost someone their life. But beneath the guilt and the shame, David could still see the man who had raised him, the man who had tried to do the best he could with the weight of his past. Max rested his head on David's knee, and David reached down to stroke his fur. He felt a strange sense of peace settling over him, as though finally knowing the truth, no matter how painful, had lifted a weight from his shoulders. His father had been far from perfect, but now David understood the depth of his regret, the reason he had carried this secret for so long. And somehow, that made the loss a little easier to bear. David sat there, frozen, the weight of his father's words bearing down on him like an anchor dragging him deeper into his own thoughts. The letter was both a confession and a cry for forgiveness, one that had never been spoken aloud. The young woman's name, Margaret, echoed in his mind, conjuring images of someone he had never met, but who had clearly been central to his father's story. Max remained at David's side, his steady presence a reminder that no matter how painful the truth might be, he wasn't alone in facing it. David looked down at the letter again, his fingers tracing the edges of the fragile paper, as if by doing so he could feel the sorrow his father must have carried all these years. Why didn't he tell me? David thought, his heart aching with the realization that his father had lived with this guilt, alone, all his life. The room felt colder now, the air thick with the secrets that had been hidden for so long. David leaned back in his chair, staring at the bundle of papers still sitting inside the box. He hadn't read them all yet. There was more to uncover, but a part of him hesitated. Could he handle more? Was he ready to learn the full extent of his father's mistakes? Max nudged his hand, and David blinked, pulling himself out of his thoughts. The dog's dark eyes were locked onto his, as if Max could sense the turmoil brewing inside him. David took a deep breath and reached for the next paper in the stack, determined to face whatever came next. It wasn't another letter. Instead, it was an old, faded photograph. David's breath caught in his throat as he turned it over in his hands. The picture showed his father, much younger, smiling with a woman he didn't recognize. Her hair was long and dark, and her eyes sparkled with the kind of joy that only youth could bring. They were standing in front of a car that David recognized as the one his father used to drive when he was younger. The woman in the photo had to be Margaret. David stared at her face, trying to piece together who she was, what she had meant to his father. There was a closeness between them, an intimacy that suggested they had been more than just friends. David's chest tightened as the realization hit him. His father had loved her, and he had lost her because of one tragic mistake. The room felt suffocating now, the walls closing in as David's mind spun with questions he had no way of answering. Why hadn't his father told him about Margaret? Had his mother known? Was this the reason his father had been so withdrawn at times? Why he had moments of silence that David had never fully understood? David set the photograph down and picked up the letter again, his eyes scanning the final lines. David, I never had the courage to tell you about Margaret, and for that I am deeply sorry. She was someone I cared about deeply, and her death was something I never forgave myself for. I know this will change the way you see me, and I can only hope that in time you will understand why I kept this from you. I didn't want you to carry my burden. I wanted you to live free from the mistakes of my past. The words blurred as tears filled David's eyes. He wiped them away quickly, feeling a deep mix of anger and sadness. Anger at his father for hiding such an important part of his life, but also sadness for the pain his father had carried alone. David looked at Max, who was still watching him intently, as though waiting for some signal from him. The dog's loyalty had never wavered, even now, when David felt so lost in his own emotions. Max had always been there, protecting his father, and now him. "Come on, Max," David whispered, standing up from the table. "Let's go outside. I need some air." The evening had grown darker as David stepped outside onto the porch, Max following close behind. The sky was painted with hues of purple and orange, the sun sinking low beyond the horizon. The fresh air did little to calm the storm inside David's chest, but at least out here, he didn't feel quite as suffocated by the weight of the truth. Max wandered a few feet ahead, sniffing at the ground, but he kept glancing back at David, as if making sure he was still there. David walked slowly, his mind replaying the words of the letter over and over. He couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. Her name felt foreign on his tongue, but she was now a central part of his father's life, a part David had never known. And what about the accident? What exactly had happened that night? His father's letter had mentioned losing control of the car, but it had been so vague, leaving out important details that David now desperately wanted to know. As he walked further into the yard, David realized he wasn't just grieving his father anymore. He was grieving the version of his father he had thought he knew, the man who had raised him, who had been a source of strength and guidance. Now, that image was tainted, altered by the knowledge that his father had been living with a terrible guilt, one that David had never suspected. Max stopped suddenly, his ears perking up. David followed the dog's gaze to the edge of the yard, where an old shed stood, its paint peeling and its roof sagging slightly. The shed had been there for as long as David could remember, though he had rarely gone inside. It had always been his father's space, a place where he kept old tools and gardening supplies. "Let's check it out," David said quietly to Max, who wagged his tail in response. The shed door creaked as David pushed it open, revealing the dim interior. Dust particles floated in the air, illuminated by the fading sunlight streaming through the cracks in the walls. Tools hung neatly on the walls, and old crates lined the floor, just as David remembered. But something felt different now. David's eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place, anything that might explain why his father had spent so much time here. And then he saw it. In the corner of the shed, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes, was a small wooden chest. David's pulse quickened as he stepped closer, his heart racing. He had never noticed the chest before. Had his father been hiding it all these years? Max stood beside him, silent and still, as David crouched down and carefully pulled the chest out from behind the boxes. It was old and worn, the wood chipped, and the metal clasps rusted. David hesitated for a moment, then slowly opened the chest, bracing himself for whatever he might find inside. As the lid creaked open, David's breath caught in his throat. Inside the chest were more papers, letters, receipts, photographs, all related to Margaret. David's hands shook as he picked up the topmost photograph. It was another picture of his father and Margaret, this time in a car, the one they had crashed in. The memories, the regrets, and the secrets his father had kept were all buried in this chest, waiting to be uncovered. David's hands trembled as he held the photograph. The weight of the image hit him like a punch. His father and Margaret sitting together in the very car that would soon be the site of the tragic accident. They looked happy, carefree, unaware of the disaster that awaited them. It was a moment frozen in time, but now it felt like a ghost from the past, a ghost that refused to be buried. Max sat beside David, his eyes focused on the chest as though he too understood the significance of what had been uncovered. David stared down at the pile of letters and photographs, each one a new piece of the puzzle that his father had hidden so carefully. He sifted through the papers slowly, each one more revealing than the last. Old love letters between his father and Margaret, notes about their plans for the future, receipts from road trips they had taken together. It became clear to David that Margaret had been more than just a fleeting romance in his father's life. She had been someone important, someone who might have changed the course of his father's life, had the accident never happened. David's chest tightened as he came across a letter from Margaret, dated just a week before the accident. The handwriting was neat but hurried, as though she had written it in a rush. "John, I've been thinking about us, about our future. I know things have been complicated, but I believe we can figure this out. Let's take one more trip together, just the two of us. Let's leave this town behind, even if only for a little while. I'll be waiting for you. Love, Margaret." David's eyes scanned the letter again and again. They had planned to leave town, to escape whatever complications had been keeping them apart. But instead, their trip had ended in tragedy, with Margaret's life cut short and his father left to carry the burden of her death for the rest of his days. David sat back, the letter still clutched in his hand. His father had been haunted by this for years, keeping it hidden, never allowing anyone to know the truth. David understood now why his father had been so secretive, why he had never spoken of Margaret. But that understanding didn't make the pain any easier to bear. Max nudged David's leg, his soft whine pulling David out of his thoughts. The dog's eyes were filled with a quiet concern, as though he could sense the turmoil inside David's heart. David let out a shaky breath. "What am I supposed to do with this, Max?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but his steady presence was enough to ground David, to remind him that he wasn't completely alone in facing the truth. As David sat there, staring at the pile of papers, he felt a new sense of urgency rising inside him. His father had hidden this secret for years, out of guilt and shame, but now that David knew, he couldn't let it stay buried. The truth needed to come out, no matter how painful it was. David stood up, his legs feeling heavy beneath him. He gathered the letters, the photographs, the old receipts, and carefully placed them back into the chest. The weight of the secrets felt tangible, as though it had become something physical he now carried. Max stood up, watching him closely, his tail wagging slightly as if to encourage David. David had made his decision. He wasn't going to let this secret remain hidden any longer. The next morning, David stood outside the church, the small wooden chest clutched in his hands. The early morning light cast long shadows across the ground, and the air was cool and still. He hadn't slept much the night before, his mind racing with thoughts of what was to come, but he had made up his mind. The truth had to be told, no matter the consequences. Max sat obediently beside him, watching the door of the church with calm focus. David hadn't told anyone he was coming, But he knew the priest would be inside, preparing for the day's service. It was time to finish what his father had started. Time to reveal the truth that had been buried for so long. David pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of candles and polished wood greeted him, along with the soft echoes of his footsteps against the stone floor. At the front of the church, the priest was arranging the altar, his back turned to the entrance. "Father?" David called, his voice quiet but steady. The priest turned, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. "David," he said, his voice filled with both warmth and concern. "I wasn't expecting to see you so soon." David walked down the aisle, the wooden chest held tightly in his hands. Max followed closely, his nails clicking softly against the floor. "I need to talk to you," David said, his throat tight. "About my father, about everything." The priest's expression softened, and he nodded. "Of course, let's sit." They sat together in one of the pews, the morning light filtering through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the stone walls. David placed the chest on the seat beside him, feeling its weight as he gathered his thoughts. "I found something," David began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something my father left behind." The priest watched him carefully, his brow furrowing in concern. "What did you find?" David hesitated for a moment, then opened the chest, revealing the letters, the photographs, the pieces of his father's past that had been hidden away for so long. "My father was responsible for a woman's death," David said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "Her name was Margaret. They were in love, but there was an accident, and she didn't survive." The priest's face grew pale, his eyes flickering with recognition. "Margaret?" he whispered, as if the name itself carried a heavy weight. David nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "He never told me. He never told anyone. He kept it a secret his whole life, but it haunted him. And now I'm the one left to carry it." The priest was silent for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "Your father came to me years ago, confessing his guilt," he said softly. "I promised him I would keep it secret, but I never imagined it would stay with him for so long." David looked down at the letters in his lap, his heart heavy with both sorrow and anger. Why didn't he ever tell me? Why did he think it was better to carry this alone? The priest sighed, his gaze filled with sympathy. "Your father loved you, David. He didn't want you to see him as anything less than the man you believed him to be. He thought he was protecting you by keeping this burden to himself." David clenched his fists, the frustration bubbling up inside him. But it wasn't right. It wasn't fair. The priest placed a hand on David's shoulder, his touch gentle. "I know it wasn't, but your father was only human. He made mistakes, just like we all do. He thought he was doing the right thing, even if it wasn't." David closed his eyes, letting the priest's words sink in. He had spent so long thinking of his father as a pillar of strength, as someone who always knew what to do. But now he saw him for what he really was, a man who had been broken by his own guilt, who had hidden his pain out of love, even if it had been misguided. The weight of the truth was still heavy, but in that moment, David felt a sense of release. His father had made a mistake, a terrible one, but he had tried to protect the people he loved. And now, David understood why. Max nudged David's leg, as if reminding him that he wasn't alone. David smiled down at the dog, his heart a little lighter. "I'll find a way to make peace with this," David said softly, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "I'll carry my father's burden, but I won't let it destroy me." The church was quiet, save for the faint sound of wind outside. David sat with the letters and photos scattered in front of him, the weight of his father's past no longer as suffocating, but still heavy. The priest remained silent beside him, letting David process the enormity of the truth that had been uncovered. Max, ever faithful, lay at David's feet, his watchful eyes fixed on his companion as though sensing the gravity of the moment. David took a deep breath, feeling the coolness of the church's stone walls seep into him. He had made a choice, a difficult one, but now that the truth was in the open, there was a strange sense of calm settling over him. It was as if the storm of confusion and anger that had raged inside him was finally beginning to pass. The priest cleared his throat softly. "David, I want you to know that what you've done here today, it's brave. Facing the truth, no matter how painful, is never easy." David nodded, though his eyes remained on the photographs in front of him. "I just wish he had told me sooner. I could have helped him. Maybe he wouldn't have had to carry this alone for so long." The priest sighed, his expression one of deep understanding. "I've seen this happen many times, David. People carry burdens thinking they're protecting others, but in the end, it often isolates them. Your father thought he was sparing you, but in reality, he was sparing himself from confronting his own guilt." David's fingers traced the edges of one of the photographs, the one of his father and Margaret standing in front of the car. They looked so happy, so full of life. And yet that same car had been the scene of the accident that changed everything. David's chest tightened, but the tears that had threatened to fall earlier had dried now. There was only a quiet sadness left. "I don't know how to feel about him anymore," David admitted. "I loved him. I admired him. But now, I don't know." The priest looked at David with sympathy. "You can still love him, David. He was a good man, even if he made mistakes. And from what I've seen, he did everything he could to be a good father to you, despite the weight he carried." David nodded, though the conflict inside him hadn't completely settled. His father had been a complex man, one who had made terrible mistakes, but who had also loved deeply. That was something David was still trying to reconcile. The priest's voice softened. "What will you do with all of this?" David glanced down at the letters and photographs. "I'm not sure yet. I need some time to think about it." The priest offered a small, understanding smile. "Take all the time you need, but remember, the past doesn't have to define the future. You have the power to choose how you carry this moving forward." David stood up slowly, gathering the letters and photographs and placing them back into the chest. Max followed his movements with quiet intensity, his tail flicking slightly as David latched the chest shut. The priest stood as well, his eyes filled with quiet respect. "If you ever need to talk, you know where to find me." David gave a small nod of appreciation before turning to leave the church, Max at his side. The cool morning air greeted him as he stepped outside, the sunlight breaking through the clouds in soft beams, illuminating the path ahead. As David walked back home, Max trotting beside him, he thought about everything that had happened. His father's secret, the woman named Margaret, the accident that had haunted his father for decades. It was all so much to take in. But now, with the truth in his hands, David realized that he had a choice. He could let his father's guilt consume him, let the weight of the past drag him down into the same spiral of regret that had plagued his father. Or he could find a way to make peace with it, to understand that his father had been human, flawed, and ultimately trying to protect him. Max barked softly, nudging David's leg as they approached the old house. David looked down at the dog, offering a faint smile. "You knew all along, didn't you?" he murmured. Max's ears perked up and he wagged his tail in response, as if acknowledging the weight of what had been uncovered. David stopped in front of the house, staring up at the familiar structure. The memories of his father flooded back. Good memories, moments of laughter, wisdom, and love. The secret his father had carried didn't erase those memories, but it did add a layer of complexity to them. David knew now that the man who had raised him had been hiding more than just guilt. He had been hiding his own humanity. He sat down on the porch steps, resting the wooden chest beside him. Max lay down at his feet, resting his head on David's shoe. For a long time, David simply sat there, the quiet of the morning wrapping around him like a blanket. The world felt different now, heavier, but somehow clearer. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, David reached for the chest and opened it one more time. He pulled out the last letter, the one his father had written but never sent. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded, but the words were clear. "To my son David, I want you to know that everything I did because I loved you. I carried this secret because I didn't want you to be burdened by it. But in doing so, I think I made a mistake. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer with you, and I can only hope you understand why I did what I did. I wasn't a perfect man, but I tried to be the best father I could be. I love you, and I always will. Dad." David closed his eyes, letting the words sink in. His father had made mistakes, but in the end, he had loved him. And that, more than anything, was what David needed to hold on to. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the chest. He knew now that he couldn't change the past, but he could choose how to move forward. His father's mistakes didn't have to define him. They didn't have to define either of them. Max let out a contented sigh, and David smiled down at the dog. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "Let's go for a walk." Together, they walked down the path away from the house, the weight of the past slowly lifting with each step. The sun was warm on David's face, and for the first time in days, he felt a sense of peace. The truth had been painful, but it had also been freeing. As they walked, David realized that life would continue. His father's memory would live on, not as a perfect man, but as a man who had tried his best. And David would carry that legacy forward, not with guilt, but with understanding.